Good evening. My name is Joseph David Cress, history and education reporter with the Sentinel newspaper in Carlisle. I'm also the author of 10 books, including 4 books in a series I call World War II Memories. Generations ago, men and women from across the U.S. answered the call to serve at a critical time when the country needed them most. They came together united from all walks of life. They trained and put on the uniform. They deployed beyond our borders to the far reaches of the globe to beat back Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. Sadly, the march of time has claimed the majority of the World War II generation. In its wake, we're left to wonder, have we really learned from their legacy? Or have we ignored the warning of the past in the greedy pursuit of the present, only to jeopardize a promising future? Tonight, you'll meet World War II veterans. You will see their faces, you will hear their stories, and hopefully, you will remember them. We begin with December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. When war came to America, we were not ready. The first 6 months were spent in retreat. There was despair, desperation, worry over whether we could even stop the Empire of Japan, let alone defeat it. We mobilized. We united our collective will behind a banner of revenge, payback for the outrage of Pearl Harbor. And for 45 months, our engines turned, our factories worked nonstop, our people served a greater purpose, and we were a marvel to behold, a sleeping giant awakened with terrible resolve. But all this rage began with a surprise attack, launched on a quiet Sunday morning against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. We turn our attention to Richard B. Metzger Sr., a sailor who survived the onslaught. He was lucky. By the end of the day, 2,400 Americans were dead, and our battle line was a shambles. I will now read excerpts from the story, A Day in the Harbor, that appears in World War II Memories, Peril in the Pacific. As he struggled to catch his breath that December morning, Richard Metzger wondered if the world would truly miss one terrified Filipino teenager. Like other veterans of the Day of Infamy, Metzger was only trying to survive the fury of the Japanese surprise attack. He had abandoned the burning wreckage of the battleship California and was swimming for the safety of a nearby ferry landing. Grabbing hold of a chain partially submerged in the water, Metzger started to pull himself free of Pearl Harbor, hoping to make it ashore. At about that time, somebody climbed up over my back and dumped me. I sank down in the water. It was a little kid who did it out of panic, one of the admiral's servants. He was like we all were. Everybody wanted to get out of the water at the same time. I heard someone say, "Here they come again." I climbed up on shore and ducked into a nearby ditch. Metzger knew about the ditch because work crews were improving the landing in the days before the attack. He ducked down into it with 3 or 4 other men. Though eventually the sky cleared of raiders, confusion reigned in the minutes after the Japanese aircraft departed the scene. An hour or so later, Metzger reported to the submarine pens where the California crew had set up a temporary headquarters. From that vantage point, Metzger witnessed horror and confusion. I saw a lot of smoke and fire. People on the ships running around with hoses, trying to put the fires out. Quite a few fellows had jumped into the water, and there were small boats running around picking those guys up. Metzger would serve 22 years in the Navy before retiring in 1956 as a lieutenant commander. He later settled in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and went to work for C.H. Maslin and Sons in 1957. He stayed on for 20 years before retiring as an assistant manager. When Metzger died at age 90, on October 17, 2003, he was survived by 2 children, 6 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren. From the start, the Pacific War saw the extensive use of aircraft carriers as the main offensive naval weapon of the U.S. and Japan. On 5 different occasions, the carrier fleets of the warring nations engaged in a new kind of warfare. One fought from a distance, exclusively with aircraft. We turn our attention to Robert L. Bowen, Jr., a gunnery officer on board the carrier USS Lexington during the Battle of Coral Sea. It was early May 1942, and the Allies were desperate to prevent Japan from seizing Port Moresby in New Guinea. I will now read excerpts from the story, Being Chased by Lady Letts, from my latest book, World War II Memories, Went Through to Victory. 5 to 6 torpedo bombers came in low over the water from the port side, spread out in a wide angle of attack. They had the carrier boxed in, Bowen said. There was no way the captain could evade all the torpedoes, no matter how he tried to maneuver the ship. I saw shells explode all around the planes, but they were pressing on. I could see the planes gain altitude as they peeled off, a sure sign they had completed their attacks. Just then, huge waves, 50 to 60 feet high, swept over the flight deck after 2 torpedoes struck the port side and exploded. The Lexington began to list as she continued to cruise at full speed. The captain ordered the ship to slow down so that work could begin on damage control. Within an hour, the crew had the pumps running to correct the list, so the flight deck could land planes. We started to recover, Bowen recalled. What wasn't known was that torpedo and bomb hits had damaged the gasoline bunkers where the aviation fuel was stored, causing leaks. As the fumes began to build up, a spark from the generator started a fire around 2 p.m., triggering a series of internal explosions. Topside, Bowen was not aware of the effort deep inside the ship to control the spread of the flames. Bowen was focusing his attention skyward, on the lookout for enemy planes, when a sound deep within the ship heralded the beginning of the end. I could only hear the rumbling and feel the vibration, he said. I wasn't sure where the fire was. I remember seeing the forward elevator shake along the edges. We were concerned over whether they would be able to get the fire under control. The situation only got worse when the last generator kicked out and the pumps ceased to function. The Lexington began to list again to port as water rushed back into the damaged hull. It was pretty clear, Bowen said. We were going to have to leave the ship. It was only a question of when. Finally, the order came to abandon ship. Bowen left Sky Forward and went down to the flight deck. There he climbed down a rope dangling from the starboard side. He entered the water and made for a destroyer that was taking off wounded from the carrier. Bowen hoped that the escort could rescue him. Just then, a huge explosion rocked the Lexington, forcing the destroyer to withdraw back around the carrier's stern and out of reach. The situation was dire. Bowen had to get as far away as possible or risk an early grave. Another explosion could scatter lethal shrapnel all over the ocean. The suction from the sinking ship could drag him down with it. I swam for a few minutes and then looked back and saw I wasn't making any progress, Bowen said. The massive port-side superstructure was catching the wind like a sail, causing the carrier to drift in his direction. Bowen was being chased down by the Lexington. Another officer floating nearby hailed a passing whaleboat that was checking the water for the loss of the wounded. Bowen was pulled to safety along with the other man. Though the Lexington was lost during the Coral Sea battle, the Japanese had suffered a setback. Their ambitions in northern New Guinea were foiled. As for Bowen, he went on to serve as an officer on board the destroyer Champlain that was fighting German U-boats in the Atlantic Ocean. After the war, he stayed in the Navy and retired as a Rear Admiral in September 1975. He then became a minister. When Bowen died in January 2014, he was survived by his wife, 2 sons, 9 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren. At Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy blunted the advance of Imperial Japan. A month later, the carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet ambushed and sank 4 enemy carriers, turning the tide of the war with the Battle of Midway. That August, the U.S. launched an amphibious assault on Guadalcanal, the first in a series of island-hopping operations that gradually carried our forces across the ocean. This brings us to George Mixel, an orphan-turned-jungle fighter who was training with the Bushmasters in Panama early in 1942. I'll now read excerpts from the story Critter Keepers, From War to Memories, Peril in the Pacific. The Army did its utmost to train George Mixel on the need to live off the grotesque, to survive the rigors of jungle warfare. We learned to kill all kinds of varmints that lived under stones and rotten trees, he's recalled. You learned to eat them in case your rations ran out. Much of the training was common sense. The Mixel learned, for example, how some creepy crawlies had pincers and claws that could hurt a man if ingested. He was told the best way to eat a bug was to close your eyes, crush it in your hands, and then pop it in your mouth before washing down the bitter taste with a swallow of warm coconut milk. Army instructors warned soldiers never to drink from a coconut that had fallen to the ground days before and split open on impact. The milk tasted like liquid soap and had a nasty way of flushing out a person's bowels. Some sources of nourishment were actually pleasant. On the limbs and branches, the heart of the banana tree made some of the most delicious salad in the world. Dangling from the tops of other trees were monkey vines, as big around as a finger, that when cut open by a bolo knife or machete, provided refreshing, watery sap. In the field, the troops had to put up with all sorts of dangerous critters. You had to watch out for the big boa constrictor because they would come into your camp at night, and if they were hungry, they would wrap around one of you, kill you, and swallow you whole. Some snakes approached 25 feet in length. One time, a soldier hit a constrictor in the head with the butt of his rifle. He believed the reptile was dead, so he dragged it back into camp to show off his conquest. The other soldiers took pictures of themselves with the snake draped over their shoulders or around the neck. Mixel was the last in line to be photographed, and everything went according to plan until he felt the snake's head start to move. I threw him down on the ground and he started crawling away. While in New Guinea, Mixel had a close encounter with a tarantula as big as a fist with foot-long legs. As the story goes, Mixel woke up one Sunday morning after spending the night sleeping under a mosquito net. He opened his eyes to find the spider 6 inches from his face. The critter was using the net as a hammock. Mixel responded to this intrusion with ingenuity and finesse. I had my machete with me, and it was laying down beside my leg. I reached down real slow and got hold of that handle. I turned the blade even with my chin. I held onto that blade and put pressure on the handle right underneath it. I made a catapult. I let go of the blade and it must have flung him out there 15 feet into the brush. Though big and ugly, tarantulas are not lethal, but their venom can make a man sick. One time a fellow soldier caught a spider out in the daylight. The man took the unlucky arachnid to a field kitchen, where he cut the critter in half and laid it out on the plate to give to the commanding officer. In training, the men learned how to trap tarantulas and cut them into bite-sized morsels for survival. George Mixel was honorably discharged from the Army on June 24, 1945. He returned to central Pennsylvania, where he worked for the New Cumberland Army Depot and retired as a storekeeper after 34 years. When Mixel died on March 4, 2019, he was survived by a son, a daughter-in-law, 3 grandsons, and 2 great-grandchildren. Meanwhile, the longest campaign of the war raged in a different ocean on the other side of the world. The Battle of Atlantic pitted Allied air and naval power against the wolf packs of the Kriegsmarine. It was early 1943, and merchant ships were falling prey to German submarines seeking to disrupt the flow of supplies from the U.S. to Britain. This brings us to Albert Moe Murtaugh, a Harrisburg native who joined the U.S. Navy in September 1942 and became an officer the following winter. I will now read excerpts from the story Baptism of Fire from the third book in the series, World War II Memories, Sentimental Journeys. The third time was no charm for Albert Murtaugh, who had a rough start on his first oceanic voyage. He had left New York Harbor on the SS Henry R. Maury, bound for Iceland, where he had orders to meet up with the USS Babbitt, a destroyer assigned to protect convoys from prowling German U-boats. But before he could arrive at his destination, Murtaugh found himself adrift in a lifeboat, struggling to survive and praying for deliverance. The engines on the Mallory broke down at least 3 times during the trip across the stormy North Atlantic. Each time, the combination troop transport and cargo ship lagged further behind. Devoid of escorts, separated from the main convoy, the Mallory became an easy target for U-402, which fired a torpedo into her side just before 7 a.m. on February 7th, 1943. Murtaugh was asleep in his uniform. It was a pretty good explosion, he recalled. It knocked me out of the bunk and onto the deck. I tried to get topside because I knew what it was. He arrived on deck to find that some of the passengers and crew had already taken to lifeboats and cork rafts, while others just panicked and jumped overboard. They didn't last too long in the frigid water, Murtaugh said. 15 minutes and they were done. Murtaugh took refuge in the last lifeboat, which was lowered into the water by the chief seaman, who lost a finger after it got caught up in the winch release mechanism. He spent the next 6 hours using his new officer's cap as a bucket to bail out the freezing water, swamping the boat from waves up to 50 feet high. We got a lot of spray. Several died of exposure. We flipped them over the side. There was nothing more we could do for them. British escort ships sailed on, leaving the Mallory survivors to the mercy of the cruel ocean. Too busy to be afraid, Murtaugh was a witness to his prayer being answered by the arrival hours later of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Bibb. We were lucky the Bibb was trailing the convoy, and we would not be here today, Murtaugh said. But it seemed like false hope at first. The cutter had reached the scene only to be called away briefly to track a U-boat. By the time the Bibb returned, only 122 of the 394 souls on board the Mallory were alive to be rescued from the icy waters. Troubles were not over for Murtaugh. On reaching Iceland, he boarded a tugboat for the voyage up a fjord to where the Babbitt waited at anchor. The tugboat engine broke down, so I had to wait for a second tugboat to complete this eventful journey. I didn't get off to an easy start. It was my first trip to sea, and I got baptized really quick. I was very lucky to survive it. Discharged from the service in June 1946, Albert Murtaugh went on to work for the Navy Depot in Hampton Township, Hamilton County. He then retired in 1975. Murtaugh died on September 4th, 2005, leaving behind 4 children, 6 grandchildren, and his wife of 61 years. As U.S. forces advanced across the Pacific, Western Allies defeated Germany and North Africa before conquering Sicily. That campaign served as a launch point for an assault on Italy, and the opportunity to open up a second front on the European continent. Since June 1941, the Germans have been fighting a brutal war on the Eastern Front against Red Army forces. One goal of Italy, later the invasion of France, was to draw German forces away to the south and west in order to speed a Russian advance and the eventual demise of the Third Reich. We turn our attention to John Otto, a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division. John had experience with combat jumps in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. In late September 1944, he participated in Operation Market Garden, a combined airborne and land assault in Holland to seize bridges over the Rhine River. I will now read excerpts from the story Getting Hit, from the third book in the series, World War II Memories, Sentimental Journeys. John Otto was taking cover in an abandoned house in the Dutch village of Mook. He could see enemy armor off in the distance, drawing closer to his platoon. I radioed headquarters, told them tanks were coming in. We had nothing but bazookas, and you had to be on top of the target to hit it effectively. One of the tanks fired a round, which exploded inside the building. I was practically on top of it, within 3 to 4 feet away, and took a load of shrapnel on my left leg, right shoulder, and chest. Soldiers nearby applied bandages to his wounds and used a small disposable syringe to administer a single dose of morphine to deaden the pain. A couple men then helped Otto to his feet, and I started to carry him to the battalion aid station before he ordered them back to their defensive position. Otto was walking up the road in plain view of German tank crews, yet the enemy soldiers ignored him. The exertion was taking its toll. The bandages came loose, were falling off by the time Otto reached the road junction. Blood bubbled out of his chest wound. He soldiered on despite the pain and managed somehow to stay on his feet. 2 GIs in a jeep charged past Otto. He hollered at them to come back. The men claimed they kept going because they didn't think Otto was an officer. I chewed him out, Otto recalled. I told them, I don't have to be an officer. When you see a guy bleeding, stop and help him. He ordered the men to load him onto the jeep and drive to the aid station. From there, Otto was evacuated to a hospital, where his wounds were more closely examined by medics and a surgical team assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. Sedated for a procedure, Otto woke the next day and was visited by a surgeon who explained how the hospital lacked X-ray equipment vital to locating the shrapnel. This made it too dangerous for staff to open up his chest and shoulder. They didn't want to risk nicking a major artery, Otto said. So instead they packed the wound with sterile gauze coated with Vaseline to stop the bleeding, while arrangements were made to ship Otto back to England for further treatment. There, a surgeon used forceps to remove the Vaseline-coated gauze. There was a little tab where the gauze came out of the wound. Otto thought it was weird to see the tab disappear into one side of his leg, only to emerge on the other side. He would spend over a month recuperating in the hospital before returning to his platoon about 2 weeks before the start of the Battle of the Bulge. After the war, John Otto returned to the U.S. in 1946 and stayed in the active duty Army a total of 23 years before retiring in 1961 as a lieutenant colonel. Otto then worked another 33 years with the federal government as a civilian intelligence gathering specialist for the Department of Defense. He retired from government service in 1994 and died on January 13, 2016 in Butler, Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, U.S. forces continued a strategy where certain islands were invaded, while others were bypassed, isolated, and starved out. As we edged closer to the Japanese home islands, the enemy became more fanatical on their level of resistance. We turn our attention to Howard Koser, a Mechanicsburg native who enlisted in the Marine Corps in November 1942 and served as a radio operator with the 4th Marine Division during operations in the Mariana Islands. I'll now read excerpts from the story Trouble on Tinian, from the second book of the series, World War II Memories, Imperial in the Pacific. Peering into the night, Howard Koser made out the menacing shapes of 4 to 5 Japanese tanks closing fast in single file down the narrow Coral Road. Long before he could see them, he heard the clanking sound of approaching treads. I knew they could do a lot of damage if they got within our perimeter, he said. But the enemy never had the chance to close the distance and penetrate the defensive line. A Marine anti-tank gun opened fire on the lead vehicle from 100 yards away, Koser said. It hit the first tank, which went into a ditch. The rest came on. The 37mm fired again. The second tank burst into flames. Then, as the other tanks turned to retreat, Kozer saw a Marine emerge out of cover in hot pursuit of the enemy. Running down the road, he kneeled and fired off a round with a bazooka, destroying that tank. But this was only the start of heavy fighting that first night in Ontinian. Early in the evening, the Japanese used organized tactics that just deteriorated into banzai attack waves near the end. They were trying to defeat us on the beach. They paid a hell of a price from naval and air firepower. The next morning, Marines found the bodies of 700 enemy soldiers stacked in heaps along the front of their line. Death almost took Kozer as daylight broke over the horizon. He had offered to relieve Howard Skinner from his post as radio operator in a tent the battalion used to direct artillery fire onto enemy targets. On arrival, Kozer heard another Marine ask the colonel if the tent should be taken down now that the Japanese could see it. The colonel said to wait until the current fire mission was completed. While experts worked the math to set the proper azimuth elevation, Skinner used the radio to relay coordinates to gun batteries in the field. Skinner told Kozer to wait until the mission was over. Kozer only walked a short distance to get a cup of coffee when an explosion knocked him flat on his face. An enemy artillery shell had struck the main tent pole, destroying the fire direction center. The whole tent was gone, Kozer said. There were guys and pieces of guys all around. There was debris raining down. Skinner was among the dead. Later, Kozer was wounded on Iwo Jima, discharged from the service on October 27, 1945. In civilian life, he worked for the former Ship Parts Control Center in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, before retirement. When Kozer died on April 18, 2004, he was survived by a son, a daughter, 6 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. On February 19, 1945, U.S. forces invaded Iwo Jima. The plan was to use the island as an air base for fighter planes to escort B-29 bombers raiding Japanese cities. It was thought that Iwo could also serve as an emergency landing field for crippled aircraft. The Japanese took advantage of the natural terrain to maximize their defenses. The result was a bloodbath, where total U.S. casualties exceeded Japanese casualties for the first time in the war. We turn our attention to Richard L. Brown, who lied about his age when he enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1943. He trained at Paris Island, Camp Lejeune, in Maui, Hawaii, before sailing for Iwo Jima on December 23, 1944. I will now read an excerpt from the story Horrors from the 4th and final book in the series, World War II Memories, Win Through to Victory. On the 4th day of the operation, the U.S. flag was raised over Mount Suribachi, heralding an iconic moment in the annals of Marine Corps history. Richard L. Brown saw Old Glory off in the distance, even as sirens and the whistles of ships offshore celebrated the momentary triumph. That night, he hunkered down beneath a canvas tarp with a war buddy from Philadelphia. The mercury had dropped from 80 to 40 degrees. The Marines were trying to stay warm. When his friend said he had to pee, Brown suggested he crawl out from under the tarp. A short time later, Brown heard a gunshot and dragged his friend back into cover. The Marine had been shot through the neck. As he bled out and died, he asked Brown to contact his parents. He gave me a phone number and address, Brown recalled. That was how it went. On day 4 or 5, Brown shot and wounded a Japanese soldier. He walked up to the man, determined to finish him off, but just then the enemy reached into a pocket and pulled out a wallet with photographs of his wife and small children. In broken English, the enemy soldier begged for his life and held up his hands in surrender. Brown spared the man. Of the 23,000 Japanese who defended Iwo Jima, only about 200 were captured. The rest were either killed by American forces or by mass suicide. The island cost the U.S. about 6,800 Marines dead and about 20,000 wounded. For Brown and the other Marines, the horrors were endless. The Japanese would load 50-gallon oil drums with nuts, bolts, and scrap metal. They had big catapults, he said. Each drum came over at us, end over end, but before it hit the ground, it would explode. The resulting shrapnel killed and wounded many Marines. Their saber swords were just like razors, recalled Brown, saying how a clean sweep could easily behead a man. But Americans were equally brutal in pursuit of gold teeth taken from enemy soldiers. The fellows would gather up so many souvenirs, Brown said. He remembered how fellow Marines would go up to dead or wounded Japanese to kick or stomp their heads, to knock loose the gold from their mouths. Then they collected the teeth in tobacco pouches. Some Marines were killed when Japanese feigned death with pull pins from live grenades. The one bright spot was American bomber crews now had a refuge. Brown remembered an early arrival. Next thing we knew, here comes a B-29 on fire. It had one motor. They, the crew, got out and hugged one another. Brown drew no comfort from the mission accomplished. He expected the worst. There was no way I was going to escape getting out of there unhurt, he said of Iwo Jima. Sure enough, 7 days into the assault, Brown became a statistic. Brown was riding on a tracked vehicle when the treads crossed over two landmines. Those explosives detonated the ammunition the vehicle was hauling, touching off a chain reaction that left behind a crater the size of a small house. Blown clear, Brown was left naked on the black sand of Iwo Jima. Every stitch of clothing had been ripped from his body except for a sock. Even his dog tags went missing. His back broken, rescuers feared the worst. They were getting ready to zip him into a body bag when the slightest hint of movement signaled to them that Brown was still alive. Brown would spend the next year moving from hospital to hospital on the road to recovery. He was discharged from the Marine Corps in April 1946 and returned to South Central Pennsylvania, where he worked for Hemp Brothers Incorporated in Camp Hill before retiring in 1987. When Brown died on June 13, 2016, he was survived by a daughter, 2 grandsons, and 4 great-grandchildren. By mid-December 1944, the Western Allies had broken out of Normandy and had raced across France into the Low Countries and the western frontier of Germany. Adolf Hitler had a choice. He could commit a strategic reserve to the Eastern Front to slow the Red Army advance, or take a gamble and launch a winter offensive in the West to split the Western Allies in the hope that they could bring them to the peace table. Hitler rolled the dice in what later became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest land battle of the war for the U.S. Army. While the Bulge is more well known to the general public, it was not the last major German offensive on the Western Front. We now turn our attention to Elmer Neff, a combat medic assigned to a battalion aid station of the 242nd Infantry Regiment, 42nd Infantry Division. The following story from January 9th, 1945 appears in the book War to Memories, The Great Crusade in Europe. Elmer Neff could not have known the tolling of a church bell would herald the start of 4 months of captivity as a prisoner of war. He was asleep around 4 a.m. when an enemy soldier crept into Hatton, France, climbed the belfry, gave the signal for tanks and infantry clad in white camouflage to attack. Operation Northwind was underway at sub-zero temperatures and 18 inches of snow. For days, Neff heard the rumble of engines in the woods nearby as the Germans moved vehicles into position. He learned later the scout who infiltrated the town died in the church down the street after being shot by an American who had also climbed the belfry. By then, Hatton was under heavy artillery fire as enemy forces rolled through the streets on their way to Strasbourg, France. Everybody was calling frantically to HQ for support, Neff recalled. The Germans just walked right through us. Morning turned crazy as the wounded poured into the aid station located in a stone building in the town center. Tempers grew short as the stress level increased, and the only visible show of support was an American tank destroyer parked in an alley 300 to 400 yards away. Its mission was to guard an intersection where two roads split, but instead the crew was using the stone building as cover to hide from incoming panzers. Afraid this maneuver could draw enemy fire, the lieutenant in charge of the aid station cussed out the destroyer crew and ordered them to get the hell out of there. Neff was busy patching up wounds and mixing sterilized water with dehydrated plasma that came in plastic bags. He administered shots of morphine to ease the pain before helping other medics load the casualties onto trucks for transport to safety. A German soldier was among those treated. Our men found him outside and brought him in. He was wounded very badly, possibly by a friendly fire from his own men thinking he was an American. Neff suspected the enemy soldier was a foreign observer who had hunkered down in a different part of the stone building. He must have slipped out during the battle to become wounded. Our lieutenant told me to take good care of the German and to watch him all the time. He thought maybe he could give us some leverage if we're captured. I admired the lieutenant for what he did. The enemy soldier was in dire need of plasma, but Neff couldn't find a vein in which to insert a needle for an IV. The German had gotten into shock, and his body, in an attempt to save itself, had collapsed all the veins to stem the bleeding. Lieutenant had to cut open the man's arm at the elbow, excise the flesh and muscle, and pull out a vein. Neff had to tie it off quickly, bandage the enemy soldier, and load him onto the last truck to leave the aid station. That was the last I saw of the German. I have no idea what happened to him. But Elmer Neff had something else to worry about. A Tiger tank had advanced up the street to park at the front door of the stone building. The tank commander ordered his crew to rotate the turret until the deadly 88mm gun was pointed at the first floor window. He was going to let one go, Neff recalled. The lieutenant yelled out, "For God's sakes, someone hang out something white." The white cloth was held out the window. Instead of ordering his men to fire, the commander climbed out of the tank and went inside the building. There he introduced himself, clicked his heels, and gave the Heil Hitler salute. He wanted to let us know we were captured. Then he gave us a lot of bullshit about excellent treatment we would receive, 3 meals a day, and how we would be taken good care of. The German officer then encouraged his captives to take what they need, including candy and cigarettes. They just wanted us to carry it for them so they could steal it, Neff recalled. Neff would spend the next 3 days marching in knee-deep snow, flattened spots by tank treads. On April 23, 1945, Stalag 4B was liberated by the Red Army, and Neff was a free man. Well, kind of. He was in the custody of the Russians who took their sweet time trying to unite Americans with their countrymen. Fed up, Neff took matters in his own hands, escaped the Red Army, and crossed the bridge into freedom. Discharged from the service in December 1945, he moved back to Mount Holly Springs, where he worked for 26 years as a local postmaster. When Neff died on December 5, 2003, he left behind his wife, a daughter, and 2 grandchildren. Elsewhere in Europe, the U.S. Army Air Force was engaged in a strategic air offensive against targets throughout Hitler's Third Reich. Lee Bertram served as a navigator on B-24 Liberator bombers flying out of England. I will now read excerpts from the story Flak Box and Jet Set, from World War II Memories of the Great Crusade in Europe. The anti-aircraft fire was so thick at times, Lee Bertram could smell acrid smoke coming off the bursts of red-hot metal splinters. At Nuremberg, it was such a clear day, they were doing optical sighting on us. They had us in what was called a flak box. The German flak came up 4 shots at a time. One was here, one was there, one was down, one was up. Different altitudes, different locations. This box was maybe 200 feet from side to side. The flak was rattling off the fuselage like a shooting gallery. It kept coming up in 5-second intervals. We had to get out of that box. Sensing that artillery was zooming in on the bomber, pilot pulled the Liberator from the box before it was too late. We went into a dive to gain airspeed and to change the metrics of where we were. We got up to 250 miles per hour and got out of that in a matter of seconds. The mission complete. Their B-24 needed 165 patches to repair all the damage from the barrage. The war was a catalyst for such innovations as the German Me-262 fighter bomber. Bertram had an encounter with the jet aircraft. I was very busy with a bomb run one day. I happened to look out the side through a plastic blister, and here came P-47s raining down through our formation. There must have been at least 24. I didn't know it, but the Me-262 had come into our formation. And they were chasing him. Of course, he didn't survive. The Me-262 can only stay in the air 20 minutes. They might get a bomber or two on a fast pass. As soon as they flare up, they go to their home base. The P-47s caught them on the final approach. I only saw one myself, Bertram said regarding jets. He was traveling 2.5 times our speed. We were probably moving at 200 knots. He was closer to 600. You could not blink your eyes and see him a second time. He made the mistake of lining up with our tail gunner, and our tail gunner took him out. He was not an experienced pilot. An experienced pilot would never come on to you dead from the tail. After a hiatus, following the war, Lee Bertram returned to active duty military service in 1948 to participate in the Berlin airlift as a navigator on transport planes. He stayed in the Air Force 30 years before retiring as a colonel in July 1973, and he later taught college-level geography courses. He lives, as far as I know, he still lives in South Middleton Township, Cumberland County. This concludes my presentation. Do you have any questions?
I had an uncle who died in the Pacific.
Okay.
And I have an uncle that survived Iwo Jima, but is no longer with us. Do battles run through the books, or are they like all of Iwo Jima in one book and then the
Well, what happened was for the most part, each person I interviewed has his own chapter.
Okay.
So that is his war experiences.
Okay.
And what I did was, at the beginning of each chapter, there's what I call a bio sketch. A beginning bio sketch, and at the end is also an ending bio sketch. So the beginning bio sketch kind of takes you from like birth to when he got involved in the military. Okay. And then the ending bio sketch was picking it up from after he got discharged to, usually in the majority of the cases now, that passed away. The dozens of folks I interviewed for this book series, there might be like 4 or 5 of them left, including Mr. Bertram. As far as I know, he's still with us. And I checked recently and I did not see his obituary, so I'm assuming he's still with us. I don't know if he still lives in South Middleton Township, but yeah, it's like, basically what happens is each story or each memory, it's either like a memory or like a cluster of related memories, has its own little headline. And it's like an interlocking, it's arranged chronologically. So it goes through their war experiences from start to finish in kind of like little vignettes, little stories. And where I need to, I connect them with linking paragraphs to kind of put context to it. And in the back of the book, every book has a topical index. So if you wanted to look up a particular thing, like say you were interested in food and drink. So any stories having to do with food and drink, there's a listing of the stories. There's a listing of all the stories and all the starting page numbers of those stories. And then you can go to that story and read about food and drink. Or if you're interested in Normandy or artillery, or, it really depends on the topic, or Iwo Jima. All the stories that relate to that topic are in the index. So you can either read the book chapter by chapter, or you can read the book topic by topic. And there's even, not in every book, I think the first book didn't have, you have the first book.
Yeah.
Does it have a chronology?
Not sure.
I think that was something I added starting the second book.
You have dedication and all, acknowledgement, introductions, and then the different skill, listing of vignettes, index, bibliography, and about the author.
Okay. Most of the books, like 3 of the 4 books, I think it's in the Pacific book, Imperial in the Pacific, have a chronology, where I actually took, or tried to take, or tried to figure out how the stories ran chronology-wise. You can actually like read the stories in sequence. You know, from the start of the war and our involvement in the war to the end. So that's another feature that I included in the books. And then 2 of the books, Went Through the Victory and Sentimental Journeys has like a chapter of like assorted memories called Other Memories that are also in there. So they're a little thicker than the first 2 books.
When you started, did you know you were gonna write 4 books?
No. When I started, I thought of it as just one book. But I saw how much I had, and I also wanted to like, just figure out the best way to roll it out. I mean, I actually started this project probably around like 15 to 20 years ago with the interviews. And for the longest time, they were kind of kept in storage. I kept very, very detailed notes. So I didn't lose anything, but they were kept in like storage. I may have written some of the preliminary drafts of some of the stories. But then I first became an author in 2009, but I needed some time to like establish myself. And I also needed some time to establish myself as an independent publisher. So I figured out a way to eventually roll these out. So basically it came out to 4 books. 2 of them cover the European theater, 2 of them cover the Pacific theater, and they alternate. And then what I did was to kind of tie them together. You'll notice if you look at the books, they kind of have the same kind of design, cover design, and also the same interior design. That's because I've been working with the same graphic artist the whole 4 books. So we kind of made a comprehensive package so that they all kind of like go together, but have their own little, you know, like the colors of the covers are different. I mean, let me see if I can, well, the colors don't come out well in this presentation. For some reason, I don't know what happened. I mean, this is supposed to be like tan, like what he has.
No.
This is supposed to be like a blue. For whatever reason, it didn't show up that well. That's the one that showed up the best. That's like an olive green. And then we have a gray, like a steel gray, like a battleship gray. So that was the idea. So, and then if there is somebody in the book, in the cover, like you met Mo Motov right over there. This is Robert Hinch. He was on an aircraft carrier. He was actually very cool. I mean, he was an amazing source. You guys all know what primary sources are, right? Not only did I have the interview with him, which lasted several hours, but I also had a long letter that he wrote his brother. I had his war diary. I had his ship cruise book. And I don't know if you're hearing all this, because I stepped away from the mic.
We can hear you very well.
Okay, I have his cruise book, so I had his cruise book, and I had ship newspapers. So I had original poems, I had original commentary that was written by the sailors during the war and produced in their ship newspaper. It was awesome with Robert Hinch. And he also met Lee Burchin. He's up there. The plane up behind that is a B-24 Liberator, just so you know. And over here but you really can't see him that well. That is Barry Rippert. He was a U.S. Marine and he was featured in this book. And they're holding up a Japanese flag. And it was another case where I knew I wanted to use this cover. I knew I wanted to use this photo as a cover because it's went through to victory. So this shows a small victory in the Pacific War. And they're holding up a Japanese flag. Now the thing about this photo is, it wasn't a very good quality photo at first. So I had to actually go to the book manufacturer and ask him to try to improve the quality of the photo to make it better, and it worked out. And what I thought was always interesting is, what's going on with this guy over here? Everyone else is like looking, but this guy is like, what is going on here? It looks like he's having an emotional breakdown. Almost like he's crying. But these other guys are like, and I'm not sure where the camera's supposed to be because one guy's looking over here, the other guy's looking over here. It's like, it's just an interesting shot. But any other questions?
Are you planning on doing the 5th book or no?
No.
There's not going to be a 5th book like this, but I'm planning another set of World War II books, World War II nonfiction books. But I'm kind of keep my ideas close to my vest, so I'm not really saying what they are exactly yet. It's just a different way to do World War II history. So I'm going to keep it at that. But then I have like 3 other books in mind that are kind of like in various stages of whatever production. There's going to be another Carlisle history book eventually. There's going to be another Cumberland County book eventually. Cumberland County history book, another Carlisle history book, like I said. And I'm actually flirting with the idea of producing a poetry book. Because years ago, I actually wrote a whole bunch of poems because I was in the middle of a midlife crisis. I was basically venting. But some of the poems are really good, I think, and I'm flirting with the idea. I haven't decided yet because it's kind of a departure from what I normally produce. So I'm not sure how well received that would be. And so any book is an investment, because it's money up front. So I kind of like to wait whether or not I'm going to do that or not. But there'll definitely be more nonfiction books. I'm pretty solid on that. Other questions? Anyone?
Anything on Korea?
No, I haven't done anything with Korea. Years ago, we were involved in a project involving, the newspaper that is, was involved in a year-long project involving Vietnam veterans called Voices of Service, but that was years ago. And unfortunately, that particular series was in 2016, and for whatever reason, newspapers.com doesn't have 2016 of the Sentinel. So I don't know why, but that's what happened.
I'm trying to think if we have a microfilm. I forget when you stop microfilm.
I don't know. It's like, yeah, it's just there's 1 year missing, and I think it might only be that 1 year that's missing.
It's weird.
We've been pretty consistent over the 100, almost 150 years that we've been around. So it's like, but any other questions? Any other comments or?
Thank you.
Thank you.